Welcome, colleagues, to this Global ABS Virtual Conference 2020, the ABS that we all need, that is going to take place from 29th of October to 25th of November. And welcome in particular to this celebration, 10th anniversary celebration of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. So happy birthday to all of us with this 10th anniversary. I'm going to give you some logistic and technical comments to be completely aware of what is going to happen during the session. Again, you know that this marks the 10th anniversary of the adoption in Nagoya 10 years ago of the Nagoya Protocol. So this session is being recorded and will be available through the global ABS community of practice, the community of practice of the UNDP-GEF Global ABS project. During this session, participants' mics will be muted, but you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A functionality available at the toolbar located at the bottom of your screen. Participants' questions will be addressed after the panelists' presentations during the Q&A session as scheduled. To continue the discussions on the topic of this webinar, please visit the global ABS community and leave your discussion on the forum section. Very important, before we start, we are having interpretation for this meeting, so please select your language. In the toolbar at the bottom, there is one button that says interpretation, and you can choose the language you want to follow. This particular session will be forecast in with Spanish interpretation and French interpretation. So please change now to the your desired channel in order to follow the session. And with this short introduction, let me just welcome the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Ms. Elizabeth Nrema. It is a pleasure to see you, Elizabeth, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Thank you for the welcoming. To all of us, indeed, happy birthday. Allow me first to read a message from the United Nations Secretary General, which I will read as it has been delivered to us on this day. And it says, the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing 10 years ago was a landmark in safeguarding the world's precious biodiversity and ensuring that the planet's resources benefit all the world's people. A protocol demonstrates how countries can come together in an innovative spirit to uphold the principles of solidarity, equality, and fairness. This anniversary comes at a time when the climate crisis is deepening and biodiversity is disappearing at a frightening rate, placing lives, livelihood, and security in danger. As the world strives to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we must pursue a sustainable pathway and mobilize nature-based solutions as an opportunity for greener and more inclusive economies. Investments in nature are an opportunity to generate economic growth founded on a culture of social and environmental justice and on the principles set by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In making this milestone, let us reaffirm our commitment to the Nagoya Protocol and to working together to advance the conservation and sustainable use of the world's shared natural capital. End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for bringing the statement of the UN Secretary General with those words about the relevance of the Nagoya Protocol and the relevance even more during this crisis, this pandemic that we are now all suffering. Please, after this short preamble with this statement of the Secretary General, is your time for your own statement. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, again. Indeed, this is now my time. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the celebrations of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, abbreviated ABS. Already, it has been 10 years since we agreed to this historical international instrument on 29th October 2010 at the 10th Conference of the Parties to the Convention held in Nagoya, Japan. The story of the convention is the story of 3 children. 1, child conservation, who is well known and oldest child, and we understood it very well. 2nd, our sustainable use, who is the creative child with high aspirations to transform the world. And our youngest child, access and benefit sharing, who is the equity dimension of the convention and has often been the least understood of our 3 children. Like all children, access and benefit sharing has required significant patience, nurturing, and understanding. We do that in order to give it the best opportunity success and eventually watch it blossom and reach its full potential. The concept of access and benefit sharing is fully enshrined in our convention, but it had a difficult start in life, and the path it has taken has never been as clear as its siblings. Article 15 of the convention gave access and benefit sharing a nudge in the right direction, but we soon noticed, as we always knew, that it has insufficient preparation for life in the real world, and that access and benefit sharing will need a little more help along the way. The adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing marked a new era in the life of our environmental family. In addition to the ambitious strategic plan for biodiversity in Nagoya, parties made a historic commitment to the 3rd objective convention by enhancing legal certainty and transparency for users and providers of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Access and benefit sharing was finally given the tools it needed to join its siblings, and therefore made the entire convention's objective and the strategic plan for biodiversity more achievable. There's a Nigerian Igbo cultural proverb which says, Oran Azu Nwa, which means it takes a whole village or a community to raise a child. Governments, donors, and other actors and organizations, we have all been the caregivers of this child, and we should be proud of all its achievements in the last 10 years. Together, at the global level, we have put in place mechanisms necessary to monitor and support the implementation of the protocol, including the access and benefit sharing clearinghouse mechanism. 127 parties have ratified the protocol so far, and as has been highlighted in the 5th edition of our Global Biodiversity Outlook launched recently, 87 of the parties have ABS legal frameworks and institutional structures in place, bringing us closer to the full achievement of the Aichi Biodiversity Target 16. A child cannot be expected to deliver right at the onset, and therefore one of the greatest achievements is that more and more people in the village are becoming aware of the existence of this child, and that its needs will allow us all to deliver on its unique purpose and make a productive contribution to the overall well-being of the entire village. Despite the child being young, today, more and more access and benefit sharing permits are being granted. And as of now, almost 2,000 certificates of compliance have been published in the Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse. Very soon, all these efforts will bear fruits and will translate into more and more benefits being shared equitably, thus strengthening their capacity and diversity. During this conference, you will also learn about the success stories in the implementation of the protocol, including agreements on the sharing of benefits. However, the implementation of the protocol has also faced its own challenges. Access and benefit sharing is a complex issue which involves multitude of stakeholders with different interests, realities, and views. Building, understanding, and open dialogue are essential to create a unified community that share responsibilities in raising this access and benefit sharing child. This is one of the main objectives of the Virtual Global Access and Benefit Sharing Conference 2020, organized by the UNDP-GEF Global Access and Benefit Sharing Project, together with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, in collaboration with the governments of Japan and Jordan, as well as other partners. The Global Access and Benefit Sharing Conference sessions will be held every Wednesday during the month of November, and they all aim to bring together the ABS community, and these are national authorities, indigenous peoples and local communities, researchers and private sector, donors, and relevant organizations to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol, to take stock of the progress made in the last decade, as well as to discuss the IBS we all need in preparation for the discussions in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Indeed, the start of the second decade of the Nagoya Protocol coincides with the development of the post-2020 framework. It is a great opportunity for us to ask a question: is the access and benefit sharing we have the ABS we all need? Dialogues such as these, organized during the Global ABS Conference, can help us all to collectively answer this question and guide our ABS into adulthood, and through those often intense and rebellious teenage years. We encourage you to share your ideas during the last session of the conference on the 5th November on building the access and benefit sharing we all need for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In short, we have managed to achieve a lot in the last decade of the Nagoya Protocol. And let us use this conference as a stepping stone to ensure the next decade of the Nagoya Protocol allows us to get the access and benefit sharing we all need. Now, dear colleagues, participants, delegates, I invite you to watch a short video highlighting some of the birthday messages we have received from you, our friends, our partners, and our colleagues. I hope this video demonstrates that the entire UN system and the entire access and benefit sharing community are fully engaged and committed to the Nagoya Protocol and its vital role in helping to make the coming years truly impactful for and people. Thank you and welcome to watch the video.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد الحبيب. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it gives me great pleasure to be with you and celebrate the 10th year anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol on the ABS. As happy as we may be that 10 years have passed and quite big strides have been achieved, such as the mapping of the traditional knowledge or even the national strategy on the conservation of crop wild relatives. I would like to emphasize that we are still just at the beginning. We need to keep the momentum going and to be ever more vigilant, since after the COVID-19 pandemic, the global dynamics have changed. This can be seen in the realm of legal frameworks, services and logistics, but above all on the ethical level, such that unfortunately illegal exploitation of the world's natural resources have become ever more rampant. This comes at a huge cost, which no one can afford, and I'm not talking purely on economic or monetary costs, but rather the result of the collapse of our ecosystem services, and with a consequence of unimaginable magnitude. Thus, as global citizens, it is our duty to prioritize our efforts in ensuring the continuation of ABS and translate it into actions on the ground. Here, I would like to draw on my religion, Islam, where it says that we are the stewards of the earth. And as the custodians, it is not for us to use and abuse the natural resources, but rather we are the keepers of it for the next generations. To conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight how His Majesty King Abdullah II took the lead by drafting the Global Charter for recognizing the rights of fauna and flora and ecosystems, which complement the international efforts on their conservation, but has taken it to the next level up. We all need to genuinely commit ourselves for the next phase of the ABS Global Project by building on our past successes, which the UN had an instrumental role in getting us to where we are today, as well as the generous contribution from GEF. I would also like to celebrate with you today the Blessed Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's birthday as it is today, and wish you all a very successful conference and a good way forward to the future. Thank you so much.
Las tres palabras que definirían para mí el acceso a recursos genéticos y participación justa de beneficios serían futuro, negocio y sostenibilidad. Porque para mí el único futuro posible para todo negocio generado por cualquier empresa a partir de la naturaleza y los conocimientos tradicionales asociados es seguir el camino de la sostenibilidad y de la equidad. El protocolo de Nagoya está teniendo un impacto muy importante en el sector cosmético. Y es que hay que tener en cuenta que la naturaleza y los conocimientos tradicionales asociados a la misma son una muy importante fuente de innovación en nuestro sector. Y los nuevos desarrollos de ingredientes en el mercado ya están tomando como referencia este marco legal. Esto ha implicado muchos cambios en la cadena de suministros y mejoras a lo largo de estos años. Además, es importante destacar que la cosmética es una de las industrias que da mayor importancia y mayor valor a todos los aspectos de sostenibilidad de sus productos. La sociedad está empezando a demandar ya este tipo de productos y exige a las empresas fabricantes de cosméticos que actúen con los valores de sostenibilidad y equidad. Y en ese sentido, el cumplimiento del protocolo de Nagoya y de otras regulaciones nacionales y internacionales de acceso justo es algo que la industria cosmética está ya empezando a aplicar y es algo que va a abrazar de una forma muy natural y muy rápida en los próximos años. El protocolo de Nagoya se encuentra todavía en sus fases muy iniciales, podemos decir que en su infancia, y tiene que crecer y desarrollarse hasta llegar a su plena madurez. Debe alcanzar un punto de mayor simplicidad en su aplicación para que sea realmente efectivo. Pero sobre todo, hay que hacer llegar a los consumidores el mensaje claro de lo que significa y del papel crucial que ellos tienen en el cumplimiento por parte de todas las industrias. Al final, no debemos olvidar que es el consumidor con sus decisiones de compra el que va a decidir el futuro de este protocolo.
We are in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, the loss of the natural world at our own hands. But while the problem is of our own making, so too can be the solutions. The protection and recovery of biodiversity can and must be done in a way that incentivizes conservation, uses wisely, reverses loss, and provides economic opportunities for people around the world. As we mark a decade of the Nagoya Protocol, it is time to renew our commitment to ensuring access to genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. It's an opportunity for the world to utilize biological resources in search of therapeutics and vaccines to manage the COVID-19 and future pandemics. Over the last few months, I've spoken extensively about how COVID-19 stimulus packages must kickstart the engines of green growth. As part of these shifts that we need to make, nature and its bounty provides opportunities, but these opportunities have to be equitably shared so that everyone moves forward together towards a sustainable future. And this is why a strong Nagoya Protocol matters more than ever. Indigenous knowledge offers us ways to tap into and protect nature, and we need to look at this as an essential ingredient for moving forward. And last, but certainly not least, our goalpost will be an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework that ensures we step up manifold the benefits of genetic resources and ensure that these are shared fairly and equitably in every corner of the world. We've made good progress in the last decade, but in this decade of action, now is the time to use science, embrace multilateralism, and build partnerships to truly benefit from nature. So, let's get the job done. Thank you.
Soy Diana Aguavil, gobernadora de la nacionalidad Sáchila. El protocolo de Nagoya es un beneficio que se deriva a la utilización de los conocimientos tradicionales de manera justa y equitativa. En este caso, la nacionalidad Sáchila, pues hemos contado con el apoyo al desarrollo y a la realización de este protocolo comunitario para el acceso y aprovechamiento de nuestros conocimientos tradicionales asociados o no a la biodiversidad y de esta manera pues respetar las normas legales de protección y sobre todo en el que somos legítimos poseedores de los conocimientos tradicionales donde podamos obtener productos derivados de las plantas medicinales. A nombre de la nacionalidad Sáchila, pues felicitamos hoy en su onomástico por un año más de vida institucional en el cual deseamos el mejor de los éxitos y muchas bendiciones. Sejo la jode, felicitaciones. Duque ho tinayo intenchi.
I am Koizumi Shinjiro, Minister of the Environment of Japan. I'm honored to have this precious opportunity to deliver my congratulations on the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the UNDP-GEF Global ABS Project, the Secretariat of the CBD, and all persons concerned for their efforts to realize this Global ABS Budget Conference 2020. First of all, I have a big announcement. The Prime Minister Suga of Japan has just declared that Japan will aim for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 to realize carbon neutrality. I believe this ambitious declaration will undoubtedly strengthen the synergy between the Paris Agreement and the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Currently, we are in the negotiation process toward COP15. The outcome is unpredictable. We will have to continue our hard work right up until the last minute. As a matter of fact, Japan experienced similar difficulties or birth pangs of the Nagoya Protocol 10 years ago. The negotiations over the ABS protocol were extended past midnight with no agreement in sight. But because we were able to overcome such difficulties and adapt the protocol, we come together today to celebrate its 10th anniversary. Although there is a diversity of strong standpoints and opinions among the parties, Japan maintains the same spirit as during the presidency of COP10. We will work tenaciously toward a successful agreement on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which I believe will lead to human prosperity. We should recognize that the COVID-19 crisis is a serious message from our ecosystems, demanding that we change our behavior. Recovery from the crisis requires the redesigning of our socioeconomic systems to make them more sustainable and resilient. It is thus essential that redesign be incorporated into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That is why we need to work in cooperation with each other toward COP15 to realize a sustainable and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. So, in that spirit, let us work together to redesign our whole society. Happy birthday, Nagoya Protocol. Thank you. Arigato.
It's also important to know that this has also made the indigenous people to recognize and to be recognized as a vital role when conservation and protection of our natural resources, and especially on the process of the genetic resources and so on, which has made them to be able to sit together as a team, as a community, develop their own biocultural protocols, community protocols that have made them to bring back their own institutions, their own traditional institutions, so that they can be able to sit down and decide who is to give a peak, that is a pre-informed consent when there is any negotiation, the mutually agreed terms, discussions that happen. These are some of the key crucial important points that are very important for us while we celebrate this. The implementation process is still on, and it's very crucial that governments really work with indigenous peoples. A human rights approach is very important for stakeholders to be able to work with us so that we can be able to understand each other and help each other in terms of our development and the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol.
Hello, this is Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, CEO of the Global Environmental Facility. Indigenous people and local communities has over many generations built up invaluable knowledge on how to use and conserve biological resources. But this knowledge and the communities that created and nurtured it are now at grave risk. We must protect them both if we are to have any hope for fostering biodiversity conservation as well as sustainable and equitable development. The genetic variability of plants, animals, and microbes may hold the key to many challenges ahead of us. We need to conserve them for our own good as well as for the generation to come. Today we mark and celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol on Accesses and Benefit Sharing. That landmark agreement opened the door for a global commitment on accessing and sharing the benefits that arise out of the utilization of genetic resources. Over the past decade, we have seen that such a commitment is vital to stemming the loss of biological resources and their genetic makeup. These biological resources provide a wide range of products and services for human benefit. Much of the world relies on traditional plant-based treatment for their primary health care. We also must maintain old and new agricultural varieties that can anticipate the impacts of climate change and sustain a growing population. The biotechnology industry is constantly harnessing living organisms to develop pharmaceuticals, cosmetic, and effective substitute for harmful herbicides and pesticides that pollute rivers, the ocean, and the health of the people. The GEF has been proud to support the Nagoya Protocol since its inception. The GEF provided financial resources for the ratification and implementation of the protocol and helped build projects on existing partnerships and joint venture of governments, the private sector, the national and international academic, and research institutions. These groups are engaging indigenous people and local communities as well as private owners and national or regional parks in the search for genetic resources of interest to agriculture, manufacturing, and other sectors. The GEF will continue to support national and regional implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. We are working to identify gaps in access and benefit sharing provisions in existing policies, laws, regulations, and developing institutional capacities. The GEF is also helping to develop and implement a strategy and action plan for access and benefit sharing measures, such as innovative policies, legal frameworks, and regulatory dispositions, as well as institutional agreements, capacity to monitor the use of genetic resources, compliances with the legislation, and cooperation on transboundary issues. We are committed to build capacity among stakeholders, including indigenous people and local communities, but especially women, to negotiate between providers and users of genetic resources. These genetic resources are a treasure trove of the planet that we must harness for the present and future generations. The GEF wishes a very happy 10th anniversary to the Nagoya Protocol and all of those who work to further its vital goals. We look forward to work together for another 10 years and beyond to foster both the sustainable development of indigenous people and local communities and the continued conservation of our natural capital. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Timothy Hodges. I'm a professor of practice at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. I co-chaired the Nagoya Protocol negotiations together with Fernando Casas through to the successful conclusion of the talks when the protocol was adopted at Nagoya in 2010. Immediate prior to that, I headed the Canadian delegations to the ABS working group meetings as I had to the negotiation of the biosafety protocol previously. Some jurisdictions have been reluctant to ratify and implement the protocol in part because of concerns regarding Indigenous peoples' rights. I'd say it's time to turn this around and see implementation of the protocol by Indigenous peoples as a good thing, a sustainable thing, and a right thing to do. We need more political and policy leadership. Yes, lawyers are great, but we need leaders as well. I'm really impressed with the sustained efforts over the past 10 years with many in terms of implementing the protocol at all levels of government, Indigenous peoples, communities, and research community in a number of countries across all regions. I think we're finally seeing a growing realization that the protocol is and has always been about sustainable development. As a career diplomat, I had negotiated many treaties in a wide range of forms before the ABS talks, but nothing could have fully prepared me for the tremendous challenges of co-chairing the protocol negotiations. We're all in this together, and collaboration is crucial, across jurisdictions, but also between ministries of health and the environment. All countries have a role to play in ensuring the flow of both samples and DSI, as well as sharing the benefits that are generated. I strongly believe that the protocol is even more relevant today than in 2010. It is a cornerstone of sustainable development and generates benefits for researchers, Indigenous peoples, industry, governments, and public and private researchers. The protocol embraces a win-win approach. Please join me and so many others from around the world in our community of practice. Join the global ABS community.
Todas y todos quienes estamos reunidos para esta conferencia global ABS 2020 y discutir la visión de ABS para la próxima década. Hablo en nombre del Foro Internacional Indígena sobre Biodiversidad. Saludamos a las organizaciones de este importante evento y agradecemos por la amable invitación. El FIP felicita a quienes han sido parte de las negociaciones del Protocolo de Nagoya, razón por la que merece esta celebración del 10º aniversario. Estos 10 años han estado marcados por múltiples avances y esfuerzos realizados a nivel mundial para su implementación. Sin duda alguna, para los pueblos indígenas, el protocolo es un instrumento perfectible que ha sentado las bases, reconociéndonos como dueños de nuestros conocimientos tradicionales asociados a recursos genéticos y recursos genéticos en nuestro territorio. Un hito histórico en el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos como pueblos indígenas. En este tiempo también hemos ganado experiencia estableciendo nuestras relaciones con las instituciones gubernamentales y usuarios en un marco de respeto. Otro de los hitos ha sido la incorporación de representantes indígenas en el Comité de Cumplimiento del Protocolo. En estos 10 años se ha avanzado en un marco de regulación legal sobre recursos genéticos, pero se ha avanzado muy poco en el marco legal e institucional en relación al acceso y la participación de los beneficios por la utilización de conocimientos tradicionales asociados a recursos genéticos y de recursos genéticos que poseemos. Por ello, el ABS que queremos debería estar centrado en las siguientes acciones. 1. Establecimiento de marcos institucionales y legales adecuados con la participación plena y efectiva de pueblos indígenas y de acuerdo a los estándares del Protocolo de Nagoya a nivel nacional en cuanto al acceso y participación en los beneficios por la utilización de conocimientos tradicionales asociados a recursos genéticos y recursos genéticos a nuestro poder que dé seguridad jurídica a nuestros pueblos y así evitar la biopiratería y apropiación ilegal. 2. La creación y el reconocimiento de protocolos comunitarios bioculturales como instrumentos efectivos para la conservación y uso sostenible de nuestra diversidad biológica y entendidos como una expresión de los sistemas normativos indígenas, los cuales pueden incluir no solo aspectos del Protocolo de Nagoya, sino también del Convenio sobre Diversidad Biológica. 3. Fortalecimiento de los protocolos comunitarios y el derecho consuetudinario para poder integrar a la relación entre proveedores y usuarios de recursos genéticos, la memoria histórica, cultural, biocultural y natural de nuestros pueblos indígenas, como un elemento clave dentro de la aprobación del consentimiento libre, previo y fundamentado, y la elaboración de las condiciones mutuamente acordadas. Asimismo, es prioritario el desarrollo e impulso de instrumentos financieros para poder hacer de alcance colectivo los beneficios económicos resultado del acceso a recursos genéticos y conocimientos tradicionales. Por último, contar con programas que fomenten el cumplimiento y la regularización de los accesos que se han dado históricamente en nuestros territorios, sin el consentimiento libre, previo e informado, es una gran necesidad que tenemos a nivel global. Finalmente, el FIP espera continuar trabajando con todos ustedes en forma conjunta para la implementación efectiva a nivel nacional y local del Protocolo de Nagoya en beneficio de nuestros pueblos y comunidades. Muchas gracias.
Good day. South Africa appreciates the global celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol, especially noting the emergence of this protocol was conceived in our country during the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. This was after the recognition of the limitations of the Bonn guidelines on access to genetic resources and fair and equitable sharing of benefits, which were voluntary and at that stage not legally binding. South Africa, as one of the most mega diverse countries in the world, played a leading role in the negotiations that resulted in this important protocol. Our country is home to approximately 24,000 plant species and boasts an entire endemic Cape floral kingdom. These biological and cultural resources underpin a significant proportion of the biodiversity economy and the many rural and urban people directly dependent on them for employment. Food, shelter, medicine, and spiritual well-being. Furthermore, our biological diversity forms the basis for bioprospecting and biotrade, thus contributing to the economic growth, commercial research, and development that underpins the well-being of our entire society. 2 years after the World Summit on Sustainable Development, South Africa regulated these commercial activities through the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act of 2004, commonly known as NEMBA, and the regulations for bioprospecting, access, and benefit sharing. These regulations were introduced in 2008. These legislative tools are now being reviewed to further align to the requirements of a dynamic and changing environment. This national effort demonstrated South Africa's commitment to the domestication of globally legally binding instruments, primarily to ensure that indigenous and local peoples benefit from the commercial use of their traditional knowledge. The NEMBA Act and its associated regulations are supported by the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefit arising from their utilization under the Convention on Biological Diversity, to which South Africa became a party in 2013. A further step to the domestication of the Nagoya Protocol includes the promulgation on the Protection, Promotion, Development, and Management of Indigenous Knowledge Act that was passed as recently as 2019. This act provides for the management of indigenous knowledge rights of communities and ensures fair and equitable sharing of benefits. These laws have increased awareness of bioprospecting, access, and benefit sharing activities in South Africa, and have provided opportunities for indigenous and local communities to benefit from their role as custodians of traditional knowledge on the useful properties of indigenous biological resources targeted for bioprospecting and biotrade. Just last year, negotiations facilitated by my department were concluded on an industry-wide benefit sharing agreement, which recognized the indigenous knowledge of the Khoikhoi and San people governing the use of rooibos, which has a variety of beverage and healthcare uses. The benefit sharing agreement brings the rooibos industry in line with South Africa's bioprospecting protocols and regulations, and sees that a percentage of the gate price of every ton of rooibos cultivated will go towards community trusts serving indigenous communities. South Africa has a dedicated permitting mechanism that regulates access to genetic resources associated with traditional knowledge. Such a mechanism guides negotiations on material transfer and benefit sharing agreements that are crucial in ensuring fair and equitable sharing of benefits. At the subnational level, systems are in place for ensuring sustainable harvesting and collection of indigenous biological resources, being supported by biodiversity management plans for priority species to ensure the long-term survival of the species in the wild, while at the same time enhancing compliance, monitoring, and law enforcement. South Africa considers the Nagoya Protocol as an important global instrument in the protection of indigenous knowledge holders of genetic resources. Although the benefits of the Nagoya Protocol have not yet been experienced by many communities, this is one protocol that facilitates redress of past imbalances through tangible, fair, and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and their associated knowledge. This protocol can be counted amongst those global instruments that contribute to the much needed global solutions for human well-being, biodiversity, health, and of course, food security. I thank you.
Para mí, el acceso a los recursos genéticos y la participación justa y equitativa es biodiversidad, justicia y equidad. La implementación del Protocolo de Nagoya en la República Dominicana ha permitido ampliar nuestro espectro de acción individual e institucional, ganando una experiencia única y valiosa para el desarrollo de iniciativas de conservación de los recursos genéticos apoyados en un marco legal, nacional e internacional. Llegó para quedarse. Para el futuro, quisiera que la utilización de los recursos genéticos esté apoyada en tecnologías pertinentes con soluciones basadas en la naturaleza y el desarrollo sostenible, con la participación del gobierno, el sector privado y las comunidades, trabajando juntas con equidad y transparencia. Desde la República Dominicana felicitamos los 10 años transcurridos del Protocolo de Nagoya y a todos los países que han firmado su ratificación. Felicidades.
10 years ago, the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing was adopted by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I had the good fortune to be there at that time. This international instrument is a landmark achievement of the third objective of the Convention, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. This is a significant achievement because ABS is an essential ingredient for sustainable development. The global market for products based on genetic resources developed by the pharmaceutical, cosmetic, agricultural, and food industries ranges between 500 and 800 billion per year. Since 2012, UNDP has been working with 45 countries to strengthen their national ABS policy frameworks and build trust between users and providers of genetic resources for the development of products that contribute to poverty reduction, food security, good health, innovation, and biodiversity conservation. In Mexico, for example, we facilitated an ABS partnership between a women-led association, Mujeres y Ambiente, and the Spanish private sector company for the development of cosmetic products derived from genetic resources and traditional knowledge. The agreement, signed between the parties, is considered one of the first cases of full compliance with Nagoya Protocol. In September, Mujeres y Ambiente was awarded the 2020 Equator Prize. Although the last 10 years have seen remarkable progress in the implementation of Nagoya Protocol, more work needs to be done for ABS to accrue substantial benefits for societies and economies while maintaining genetic resources and traditional knowledge for new discovery. More government and private sector commitment and investment are needed to position the ABS and genetic resources at the heart of national development and bioeconomy policies that facilitate the transition from grey to green economies, bringing together users and providers of genetic resources, provide green jobs, improve livelihoods, and deliver nature-based solutions. I wish the Nagoya Protocol a very happy birthday.
Dear friends and colleagues, It is a great pleasure to join you today in the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. This anniversary marks an important milestone in the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. I am particularly pleased to see that the Nagoya Protocol to date has 127 parties from all regions, which attests to the importance that countries attach to it, and also indicates the general commitment towards its implementation. As you know, since the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol, the Secretariat of the International Treaty has been working very closely with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in various activities aimed at supporting mutual supportiveness in the implementation of Nagoya Protocol and the International Treaty. Shortly after the adoption of the protocol, both secretariats joined hands in organizing a series of awareness-raising and capacity-building activities to support the ratification and early entry into force of the Nagoya Protocol. On July 9, 2018, the Executive Secretary of the CBD and I signed a new Memorandum of Cooperation on the margins of the second meeting of the CBD's subsidiary body on implementation. The memorandum was intended to enhance institutional cooperation between the two secretariats, especially in capacity development activities dealing with access and benefit sharing, including the organization of workshops, meetings, seminars. It also included the coordination of technical assistance at different levels and the exchange of information on capacity development and other relevant activities. The Secretariats of the Treaty and the Convention have continued their collaboration with a number of partners to build capacity for mutually supportive implementation of the protocol and the treaty. I am very pleased that the cooperation between the two secretariats has continued to flourish and grow over the past years. On this special occasion, let me conclude by reiterating that the Secretariat of the International Treaty remains fully committed to continuing its close collaboration with the Convention and working jointly for the harmonious and mutually supportive implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and the International Treaty. I look forward to the next 10 years of collaboration and much progress for the protocol. I wish you a very happy anniversary.
In terms of important achievements, the protocol has contributed to the recognition of the concept of access and benefit sharing in other international forums. My birthday wish for the Nagoya Protocol is that it is fully integrated into sustainable practices of both providers and users. In other words, that it really becomes the new normal. I take this opportunity to encourage you to continue working towards ABS implementation and to join the global ABS community.
I would like to extend my happiness of this event dedicated to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived from their utilization, ABS, and to actively contribute to the post-2020 biodiversity strategic framework discussions on ABS. Ladies and gentlemen, Jordan is a small country with many development aspirations and challenges, coupled with extremely limited natural resources. However, with a remarkable biological diversity, the varied physical characteristics of the country have yielded an unusual case of richness of landforms and biological diversity in terms of landscapes, ecosystems, and species. And in Jordan, as we deeply believe of the importance of genetic resources and its linked traditional knowledge and the equitable sharing of the benefits derived from it, especially for the local communities, Jordan was one of the first countries endorsed the Nagoya Protocol. And we were proud to be chosen as one of the 23 countries implemented the UNDP GEF Global Project on Access to Genetic Resources and Benefit Sharing, and one of the champions of this project as we fulfilled all its requirements and commitments. And we successfully finished legal framework. As a next step, we hope to have the opportunity and all resources to implement next phases focusing on capacity building and raising awareness regarding the importance of the genetic resources and maintain the rights of the local communities to be benefited from its linked traditional knowledge. His Majesty King Abdullah II at the United Nations Summit on Biodiversity warned that nature itself is now existential peril. Its sustainability for future generations in jeopardy, and the impact of food security is threatening humanity's very existence. COVID-19 has taught us a lesson. We cannot keep neglecting nature and expect no consequences. Finally, I would like to extend my great gratitude and thanks to the organizers of this important event and wish the Nagoya Protocol a happy 10th anniversary and a prosperous future for ABS. And I hope that we all achieve the goals that we aspire to ensure the sustainability of the biological diversity.
Thank you. We would like to apologize for the quality of the projection of the video. It was a problem with the connection, not with the video, but as the sound was quite acceptable, we did not want to further delay the event trying to figure out this technical issue. Thank you for your understanding and for being with us. All the videos, including this compilation, are available in the website of the Global ABS community, and we invite you to go there and watch it again and watch all the messages that we have received as birthday wishes for the Nagoya Protocol. Thank you, Elizabeth. The Global ABS project has been very privileged to work and organize this event and the conference with your always enthusiastic and innovative team on access and benefit sharing. And we are delighted to be under your leadership during this Global ABS Conference 2020 and for the challenging negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you to all the colleagues that have sent their messages with their reflections about the meaning for them of the Nagoya Protocol, the reflections about the current difficult momentum that the world is transiting through and the need for action, but also with their birthday wishes for the protocol. Congratulations to the colleagues from Japan for that commitment to zero net emissions in the year 2050. And we hope that other important commitments related to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will also follow from them and other countries. Particular thanks to our colleagues in Jordan for your warm and engaging words. We all should be in Jordan, enjoying the incredible places, landscapes, and peoples that you have shown us in your videos, as this conference was originally planned to take place there. Thank you for reminding us that this time will pass and we will be able to reunite and be together, sharing and enjoying magical places like the ones in Jordan. A special thanks to Her Royal Highness, Princess Basma bin Ali, for being a true ABS champion and to remind us with her example that it is everyone's duty to pursue the changes that are needed to make a more sustainable world. We hope that you can join us, Your Highness, live as a panelist in the final session about the ABS that we all need for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework on November 25th. Wow, that was a great start for a birthday party with such a series of simple and strong messages. We need to move into the panel, but before doing that, this is supposed to be a party, right? And a party without music and funny faces, it couldn't be a party. So let's make some adjustments. Give me 1 second to make some adjustments because we need something here, right? That's better for this part. Excellent. Yoo-hoo! Okay, so with these adjustments, I would like to say today we are paying tribute and expressing our gratitude to all the persons that first, through their efforts, made the difference and led the process of the adoption of the protocol, but also the ones that push for its entry into force and the implementation around the world. In this case, I have to thank the Earth negotiations bulletins and all the colleagues, because with that information, we have managed to put together some of the faces that brought us here. I also went back to 2010 to check the best party hits of that year, and I tried to find some songs that could fit into the international negotiations. In that sense, I think 2010 was the year. It was difficult. It was difficult to choose which party hits were the best, but I think that year was particularly fruitful for the Black Eyed Peas. And actually hearing their songs, I started to think that they were following or even inspired by the Nagoya Protocol negotiations. This is the result. I hope you enjoyed the selection of pictures and songs. So, Mari Carmen, here we go.
And the bass keeps running, running, and 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 in this context, there's no disrespect. So when I bust my rhyme, you break your necks. We got 5 minutes for us to disconnect from all intellect and let the rhythm affect. Lose the inhibition, follow your intuition, free your inner soul and break away from tradition. Cause when we be out, bullets bullet beat out. You wouldn't believe how we wow. Till it's burned out, turn it till it's burned out. Act up from northwest east side. Everybody, let's get into it. Get started, get it started, get it started, get it started.
Let's get it started, huh? Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started, huh? Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started, huh? Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started, huh? Wow, that was the first hit, but we have other ones, okay? So more are coming.
I came to dance, 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 dance. I hit the floor cause that's my plans, 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 plans. I'm wearing all my favorite brands, 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 brands. Give me some space for both my hands, 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 hands. You, cause it goes on and on and on. And it goes on and on and on, yeah. Throw my hands up in the air sometimes.
Say hey ho,
Gotta
let go.
I wanna celebrate and live my life.
Say hey ho.
Baby, let's go. Cause we gon' rock this club. We gon' go all night. We gon' light it up like it's dynamite. Cause I told you once, now I told you twice. We gon' light it up like it's dynamite. I came to move, 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 move.
Espera, a ver, making on. I just want it all. I'm gonna put my hands in the air, put your hands in the air. I throw my hands up in the air sometimes, saying hey ho, gotta let go. I wanna celebrate and live my life, saying hey ho, saying hey ho. Wow, fantastic hit. But now we move into more serious business, into the final part. Let's go. We're ready. To the other side. Just you and I. Just you and I. I will fly. Fly the sky. For you and I. I will try until I die. For you and I. 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 Meet me halfway in the negotiations. Can we? Woo! World champion! Any farther than this. Wow, 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 wow. So we reach a point of the negotiations where we move into a COP, and a COP is definitely long nights. All of it. Fill up my cup, drink. Mazel tov. Look at it dance. Just take it. All of it. Let's paint the town. We'll shut it down. Let's burn the roof. And then we'll do it again. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. And we did it. And do it. Let's live it up. And do it. And do it. And do it. Do it. Do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Here we come. Here we go. We gotta rock. Easy come. Easy go. Now we on top. Feel the shot. Body rock. Back in those south. Round and round. Up and down. Around the clock. Negotiations. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. Party every day, party every day. That tonight's gonna be a good night. 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 Woo-hoo. What a hit, what a hit. But then we had entry into force and then implementation. So what's next?
This is International Big Mega Radio Smasher. It's time! Having a good time with you, I'm telling you. I had the time of my life, and I never felt this way before. And I swear
This is true, and I owe it all to you.
dirty bit. Baddest chicks in the club, it's like that. A good time with you, I'm telling you. I had the time of my life, and I never felt this way before. And I swear this is true, and I owe it all to you.
Wow, 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 wow. As you could see, I was missing that party. We ended so late in Nagoya that we didn't have to celebrate. It was 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't remember. So I have been waiting 10 years for this party. I was expecting a face-to-face meeting, and I have to organize this on Zoom, you know? So please, I presume after this, UNDP is going to just resign my contract. So if you have any offer, I will be open to collaborate in any project on ABS or anything else, okay? Yeah. That was fun. I hope you enjoy. I hope you saw your pictures here and there. I know it's time to move into more serious business, into the panel, as we are running late as usual. Before doing that, I would like to indicate that there are some rumors in social media that the head of the ABS area at the Secretariat, I will not give names, but Mr. Shikongo, of the convention, is also the singer of the Black Eyed Peas. But I checked it back in 2010. Some of the dates of the concerts coincide with some ABS meetings. So I can assure that he is not the singer or the writer of those lyrics, okay? Now, without any further distraction, it is time to move into our panel. To show that I can be serious too, I'm going to remove these glasses because they don't have the current things that I need. So now, without any further distraction, let's move into the panel as I just indicated. Let me quickly introduce our panelists, our guests today. First, Timothy Hodges, professor of practice at McGill University. As all of you probably know, he was the co-chair of the Working Group on Access and Benefit Sharing of Genetic Resources under the Convention on Biological Diversity from 2006 to 2010. A former career diplomat, he has been involved in a wide range of international files relating to technology transfer, science, policy, biotechnology, intellectual property rights, genetic resources, indigenous issues, global change, and circumpolar affairs. Negotiated under the GA, WTO, UNCBD, UNFCCC, CSD, and numerous other international organizations. Hello, team, how are you? Thank you for joining us. Next is Ms. Norma Munguia, consultant on environmental and sustainability. She has more than 20 years of experience working in the natural resources, energy, and sustainable development field. She was General Director of the Primary Sector and Renewable Natural Resources, Semanat, Mexico, and the coordinator of the International Affairs Unit in the same institution, as well as a Director General for Global Affairs at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. She has been an international negotiator at the UNFCCC, CBD, Agenda 2030, and other multilateral agreements. Welcome, Norma. Pleasure to see you. Next speaker will be Mr. David Hafashimana, ecologist, biodiversity and biosafety senior consultant, also with experience in the agriculture and rural development field. He served for 5 years as the director of research at Naro Bulini Zonal Agricultural Research and Development Institute, and also was a senior research officer at National Forestry Resources Research Institute. as well as retainer consultant on biosafety at United Nations Environment Programme. Mr. Hafasimana represented Uganda in the ABS negotiations and also the African group. He drafted the Bonn Guidelines in the year 2000 and also represented Uganda in the negotiations of the ABS working group that culminated into the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us. Next speaker, Mr. Ugo Scali, Head of Unit of the Multilateral Environmental Cooperation in DG Environment of the European Commission. He has served as a Head of Unit for the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the European Commission in different areas such as environment, eco-innovation, and circular economy, global sustainability, trade and multilateral affairs, and Department for Economic Policy and European Integration. He was also Minister Consular at the mission of the Republic of Austria to the United Nations in Geneva. Welcome, Ugo. I hope he is connected as he was having problems before. Next, our hero tonight, Ms. Janet Love, Senior Diplomat with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She was head of delegation for New Zealand during the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol. She also co-chaired the Intergovernmental Committee for the Nagoya Protocol. Janet has had a diverse diplomatic career working on Asia, Europe, and Pacific issues, as well as human rights and the environment. Overseas assignments have included Tokyo, Suva, Brussels, and Kobe, where she worked as an economist at the WHO Center for Health Development. Janet has served as ambassador to the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and the Holy See. And she's our hero because she's based in New Zealand and it's probably 3:20 in the morning, I believe. So thank you so much. Particular thanks to you, Janet, for being with us. Next speaker will be Ms. Lucy Mulekeni, Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network and part of the Maasai indigenous community in Kenya. She has coordinated sustainable development training and capacity building for indigenous rural nomadic pastoralists and hunter gatherers that utilize traditional knowledge and incentivize conversations on biodiversity. Ms. Lukenli is one of the co-chairs of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Lucy, Avari. And our moderator, Dr. Balakrishna Pisupati, who is the chairperson of FLEDGE, a specialist in conservation and development with close to 3 decades of experience working in the field. Mr. Pisupati has served as Vice Chancellor at the Transdisciplinary University of India, Chief of Biodiversity, Land Law and Governance Programs at United Nations Environment Programme, Senior Policy Fellow at Fridtjof Nansen Institute, Chairman of the National Biodiversity Authority of the Government of India, Coordinator of the Biodiplomacy Program at United Nations University, UNO, in Japan, among others. He has advised more than 30 countries globally on conservation and development policy and has served as advisor to international bodies. Colleagues, I think I have fed the panel already with different questions. Who hit the floor during the negotiations? Did really parties meet halfway? How Norma, more importantly, how Norma got the signature from Harrison Ford? But Bala, you are now in charge of the panel. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Alejandro. And it's a very difficult job after such a brilliant party you have hosted. And the video, especially for a lot of us who have been in the field of access and benefit sharing and the convention, it's extremely nostalgic. I was so sort of touched to see the first image of one of the pioneers of discussions related to access and benefit sharing, Dr. Tewolde Exiaba from Ethiopia, appear on the screen. So certainly, thank you very much, both to the UNDP Global ABS Project, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat for asking me to moderate this session. And of course, as all of you would recognize, as we've just in the midway of concluding our party, celebrating the 10th birthday of Nagoya Protocol, it's also time for us to think, reflect on the issue of access and benefit sharing, how it all started, where it started. And of course, Alejandro's slides did project some historical perspectives in terms of individuals involved in the process, but there are also some technicalities, positions, politics that were involved in shaping up the Nagoya Protocol. So what we would like to do in this panel, where we have a very distinguished set of panelists from various backgrounds who are directly involved in the negotiations, continue to be involved in the implementation, but also several of the panelists who would look into the future of the Nagoya Protocol also being with us. And personally for me, it's extremely touching, because the first time I heard the word equity in the international multilateral negotiation process was the Commission on Plant Genetic Resources of Food and Agriculture. Many of you would recognize the words farmers' rights. Very interestingly, there was a very, very nice set of words that was said when we were finalizing the definition of what is meant by farmers' rights. When somebody said that equality means giving a shoe to everyone, but equity means giving a shoe that fits to everyone. So those of the colleagues who actually were involved in thinking about the issues of access and benefit sharing as the third objective of the convention, we should certainly salute them. Because many times we always strive to do things right. So we are very good managers. But several of colleagues who were a part of this process from the Nagoya Final Act in Nairobi that led to the adoption of the convention itself at the Earth Summit were also doing the right things. They were just not doing things right, but they were doing the right things. So that I call as the leadership. So we had a set of brilliant leaders who foresaw what actually was coming. But of course, when you're thinking ahead of time, the biggest challenge we have is that it's very hard for a lot of people to understand what is the background, what is the basis for some of that kind of an uncommon thinking. Ethics and equity were never a part of the multilateral negotiations thus far. It was a very new concept. People did not understand how to actually translate them into language that can be found as a part of the Article 15, and also how to implement. So what I'd like to do is to start the session by reflecting on what actually went into the background, what actually happened between 1992 when the convention was adopted, 1993 when the convention came into force, and 2010 when we adopted the Nagoya Protocol. So I'd like to ask our panelists, Tim Hodges, to provide his reflections, provide his comments in terms of the background and how this all worked up in terms of becoming the access and benefit sharing provisions of the Nagoya Protocol. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bala. Well, may I start with simply wishing everyone the protocol happy 10th anniversary. It's a real pleasure to be here, and as you said, Bala, it's quite touching for many of us. I also wanted to clarify before responding to a very crucial question you posed, Bala, by noting, at least in my memory, unlike Alejandro's, there wasn't much partying going on in the course of the negotiation. But perhaps I missed it because I was busy writing the protocol and many of you were out partying, but I suspect that really wasn't the case, was it? Again, it's a pleasure to be here. We've got a great panel in my estimation, and includes many of the major players in the negotiation, and also importantly in the interim process, including, of course, co-chair Janet Lowe. So many friendly faces, many of them looking a little bit older, but I do hope also a little bit wiser. And again, thanks to the organizers of this event, UNDP, Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity, FLEDGE, Jordan, and all partners. As you know, I co-chaired the protocol negotiations through to Nagoya with my, of course, my very close friend and masterful counterpart, Fernando Casas from Colombia. Well, unfortunately, Fernando can't be here today. He does send his warmest wishes to everyone and offers a big congratulations to all. I'm pleased to note, however, that Fernando and I, may not surprise you, have been in regular and close contact over the years, and in fact have together prepared for this event. So when I speak today, it will be from the perspective of both Fernando and myself. And so let me launch into the response by wishing you a very happy anniversary from the co-chairs of the ABS working group. So, Bala, you mentioned ethics and equity and the Nairobi Final Act. Again, it's a crucial question that you've posed, and we don't have much time, but I do think the history, the background is very relevant, not only to the negotiation, to the final words of the Nagoya Protocol, but also to its implementation, as relevant today as it was 30 years ago. As you know, Fernando in particular spent many of his younger years in the prep comms for UNCED, and he also led his delegation to the CBD process, together to the implementation of the convention itself. I guess I should mention that in Agenda 21, biodiversity, agriculture, and technology were negotiated in the framework, I think, largely in the framework of the North defending the environment and the South advancing development. That, I believe, is the case, was the case. And so we actually end up with sort of a radical stance with those defending on one side conservation, and then on the other side, protection of biodiversity, and then also focusing on, in the CBD, for example, beyond UNCED itself, is focusing on conservation as a trade-off for development. And so that really is the informing context for what happened subsequently. Also importantly, from UNCED onward and in the negotiation of the CBD, an atmosphere of distrust was born. And that's clear in the way we've addressed the three objectives of the CBD since then and from the beginning in the Nairobi Final Act. And if you look at the relative weight of the language and for, let's say, for priority action, we have conservation and sustainable use underlined, not so much when you look at, in fact, the third objective. So the relative weight indicates the tension as well. And years later in the process of implementing the CBD, we believe that the parties were never that comfortable with incorporating things like biotech-related issues, such as microbial genetic resources in the programs of work of the convention. And this distrust was still present in COP10, as you will recall, where the delegates were focused, of course, on the negotiation of a strategic plan and the Aichi biodiversity targets. But in the end, of course, it was somewhat overshadowed by the shaky final moments of the negotiation of the protocol. Bala, you mentioned the words ethics and equity. Remarkably, despite the ethics-related language of the third CBD objective and the mandate of the working group itself, the ABS working group, during the course of the negotiations, there was very, very little overt reference to ethical outcomes, incredibly so, with the important exception, of course, of indigenous peoples' representatives. Instead, the focus was on a deal on access in return for benefits or benefits in return for access. But over the years, we've become increasingly aware and understood the protocol to be centrally about ethics and rights, despite, again, the fact that these words were not often used by the negotiators, and the focus was instead on making a deal. But precisely because we see it as an instrument for ethical advancement, we see ABS as being a powerful tool for reconciliation in our own countries and in many others. And that's why we worked so closely with IPLCs during the negotiations and implementation of the protocol. And I'll get back to the IPLCs shortly. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Tim. Very sort of articulate intervention. And certainly you did mention a couple of triggers for the entire discussion on access and benefit sharing. If you look at the late 80s, early 90s, the advancements in terms of biotechnology, the investments and the technology needed to come up with products based on genetic resources was very, very immense. And certainly that also was a trigger for a lot of developing countries, the countries with very rich biodiversity, what we call as mega biodiverse countries, to actually stand up and say that, look, a lot of resources that belong to us are being used with no element of consent being sought from us on how they're being used. And once commercial benefits are made out of these resources, so using these resources, we hardly have any methodology, any framework by which we can seek the benefits and a share of the benefits. So certainly the industry, the business have had a very, very important role to play in the negotiations. And I do distinctly recall the comments made by the Honorable Minister from South Africa, because many of us who were a part of this process would also recall that Article 15 of the Convention speaks about access and benefit sharing, and it is prerogative for all the contracting parties to the Convention to actually implement the provisions related to access and benefit sharing. However, we did recognize, as and when we started implementing the protocol, that this particular provision of the Convention requires more special attention. The similar attention that was given to biotechnology and the negotiations that parallelly started to come up with the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. We did come up with the Bonn guidelines, voluntary in nature, adopted in 2002. And as rightly pointed out, the World Summit on Sustainable Development also called for having an international framework on benefit sharing. If you actually look at the language of the outcomes of the summit, it actually says that the need for having an international framework on benefit sharing. And that's also gave birth to the like-minded group of mega biodiverse countries. A lot of us who are a part of the process recognize the big contributions made by LMMC. But certainly one of the key issues that started hitting a lot of us who were involved in the process, who were involved in the implementation, who were in the interpretation of Article 15 and subsequent elements of the Bonn guidelines and the outcomes of the World Summit, we were hit with two questions. One, there is no one who actually refuses to accept the fact that benefits have to be shared fairly and equitably. But at the same time, the biggest challenge we had, whether you come from a developed country or you're coming from a developing country, how do you do it? What is the mechanism? Because we have never used these kinds of frameworks before, either from a national environmental law perspective or from an international environmental law perspective. So certainly we did have had these questions, led a lot of us struggle to reflect the spirit of Article 15 of the Convention, and to the time we started negotiating the elements of the protocol. I mean, we called it at that time the international regime on access and benefit sharing, because we didn't at that time even know that there will be an agreement for a legally binding protocol when we started. So from that perspective, I'd like to now request a colleague, David Hafashimana, and a colleague, Hugo Shali, who are very intimately involved in the negotiations, as well as in the early stages of implementing Article 15 of the Convention, to provide us some reflections on what were the difficulties, what were the challenges that led us to agreeing for a special and a specific international protocol on access and benefit sharing.
David, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you very much, Tim and Krishna, for the introduction to our panel discussion. And unfortunately, I don't have the history from 1992. 1992, I was involved in biodiversity conservation issues, but at a national level. I later joined the CBD processes in 1995. And then the Rio ABS-related work, 1998, 2000, yeah. But when we look at well, I also happen to have been privileged to have negotiated the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety right from the beginning to the end. And I'd like to start from Article 15 itself and the third objective of the convention. Indeed, the third objective of the convention and the inclusion of Article 15 was a major landmark in the conservation agenda globally. But when we look at the drafting of Article 15, we find that most of the responsibilities are given to national governments, parties. Well, it was a very good achievement, having recognized internationally that parties had the responsibility and they own all genetic resources within their jurisdiction. But then, even if the parties were to put in place national instruments on ABS, such national laws could not be functional beyond national boundaries. Now, when we look at Objective 3 of the Convention and talk about fair and equitable sharing of benefits, it already indirectly implies that access had been going on before, but probably the sharing of benefits was not being done in a fair and equitable manner. And that's probably why that objective had to be stressed. And essentially, when there is sharing of benefits in an unfair and equitable manner, we realize that some countries or some entities were benefiting from the process than others. And therefore, I think there was limited political will among those parties where they were either benefiting or their citizens were benefiting from this unfair benefit sharing to kind of facilitate the expedition of the process. Now, of course, why it took so long, I would again say that for most countries, there was no capacity to draft an effective legal instrument to put into practice the provisions of Article 15. From a developing country perspective, from 1992-93, when the convention came into force, we didn't see much in terms of technology transfer in the area of access and benefit sharing. There was definitely tremendous support to developing countries in the areas of conservation and sustainable use from early 1990s. But then the one of access and benefit sharing did not take place until much later, probably long after the negotiation and drafting of the Bonn guidelines on access and benefit sharing. And in my country, particularly, I participated in the drafting of the Bonn guidelines. And immediately after that, armed with the Bonn guidelines, that's when we had the capacity now to draft our own national law, which was adopted in 2003. Of course, the technology transfer later started peaking. That's when we saw the likes of the ABS initiative for Africa, which was first spearheaded by Germany and later joined by a couple of other European countries. And then more and more countries started gaining the courage and capacity that they needed to draft ABS rules and laws in international level. But of course, again, those had their limitations until we had to get into the actual negotiation of what we have now as the Nagoya Protocol. Now, getting back to Article 15, for instance, when we compare it with Article 19, Section 3 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which led to the negotiation of the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. With the Article 19.3, it was already talking about, already pointing to a protocol. Parties shall consider the need for and modalities of the protocol. There is nothing of that nature in Article 15, and that took us a long time. We took over 2 years negotiating what kind of international regime or instrument we are going to have until much later in the negotiation, when the issue of a legally binding treaty came on board. I'll stop here for the time being, then let our colleague Hugo to also give his perspective.
Thank you, Hugo. Over to you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see so many well-known faces with whom I had the pleasure and the honor to spend much time together in various places that you showed in the presentation. And I think we spent many nights together even, but perhaps not at all that parting as the images might have indicated. I cannot pretend to go back as far as David in my dealing with the Biodiversity Convention. Although I had the pleasure of being involved in the final stages of the CBD negotiations in 1992, when I was drafted into the negotiating team, being originally a climate change negotiator myself. So, and at that time, for me, that was a very interesting experience. But coming back to CBD, right at the time of the Granada workshop, where actually the negotiation, I think the seriousness towards the what was become the Nagoya Protocol was to start and to hit off. And Tim, I think, will remember fondly some of those nights in Granada. I have to say it's interesting to get the perspective of David, because the way that I was looking at the CBD at the point in time was that the statement of general principles does not always lend itself to a common interpretation of the duties and the obligations arising out of them. And I think that that was a growing realization in the years that I was involved on the EU side in the negotiation, preparation, and then the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol, that if you wanted to have an international system whereby there would be different sides working together in trust and confidence, you actually needed a more clear and enforceable and reliable framework. So for me, the third objective of the convention, together with Article 15, was the starting point, was the springboard for going towards an operational system to look at the access and benefit sharing. And I think that we went there through several loops, trying to understand what would be the legal boundaries, to understand what would be the scope of the material that we would deal with, to go through a lot of definitional questions, so that in the end, we would come up with an instrument that we would all know exactly what we were talking about. And I think since the Article 15 comes out of the recognition of the principle of sovereignty over natural resources, the Nagoya Protocol is a true child of the CBD and applies to the CBD covered material in the legal framework that was established on the CBD. But in such a way in Article 15 that I think everybody recognized that, and David said it himself, that the national legal frameworks that slowly started emerging had to be completed by an internationally agreed instrument that would give a framing to that one. And I think that was the time for me when I saw this common understanding, some emerging slowly, and I think Kali was certainly a defining moment in that regard, that here was a common endeavor for all of us so that we could actually continue to benefit together from everything that the Earth has to offer in that regard and in that occurrence from the utilization of genetic resources. And I think that was a laborious exercise, but I think it brought together at the end the countries that had genetic resources on their territory that they wished to have under their jurisdiction, and offering them for utilization, access and utilization by researchers and economic operators coming from third countries. And on the other side, those who wish to access and utilize, looking for legal certainty and looking for a complete framework under which they can actually undertake their activities, creating the benefits that could be shared. But because let's not forget, without access and without utilization, there are no benefits to be shared. So I think that was, I think, a clear principle which underpins the Nagoya Protocol as it now exists. And I think it's this important, it's two pillars or three pillars on which it actually resides. One is the access legislation of the countries of origin. The second is the compliance measures by the users, and those linked together by the international system that we have created. And I think that was a very large achievement of the international community, that we actually could agree in the night after my birthday, because I always remember the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol because it happened on the day after my birthday. And I think that is something that I will never forget and will cherish, that as part of the achievements of a global coalition of those supporting the full implementation of the third objective of the CBD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. And as Alejandro was mentioning, we have a set of excellent panelists with enormous number of years of experience, both who participated in the negotiation process, but who are also involved in the implementation. I'd like to now ask Norma Mungia to actually share her experiences on the highs and lows in terms of the protocol negotiations and implementation. And it will be the same question where we'd like to also hear from Janet Loy and also Tim Hodges. Norma, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bala, and hello to my colleagues. And it's always nice to be with colleagues that we've shared very difficult moments, but also times of joy when we had the adoption of the protocol. I think, like in all international negotiations, there are highs and lows, and I think the most frightening part was when, in quite a few meetings, we had this feeling that we were not going to make it, and that, at least for us, it was a very frightening time, because we were putting all our efforts and also all our hopes in getting this such important protocol out, because we knew it was going to be a very transcendental document in the longer run. And we were going to be finally seeing Article 15.3 in place. And reaching to the point where negotiations were going to be over with no agreement, it was really, really frightening. And I really want to thank the African group that when they came into that meeting room in Nagoya, asking for this fund, and it was actually inserted that in the protocol, in one of the articles. I think that made us understand the important part of sharing the benefits. And if I recall well, it was the very last day, and it was only hours before the closure of the whole COP
was going to take place. So I cannot explain to you how happy we were when we heard from the Japanese delegation and also the co-chairs that were coming out with this document, this protocol. And it really reflected what we were looking for. And that was the high, or the highest for me of the whole, all the meetings that we had been attending. And but I can tell you that we had very, very bad nights, not only negotiating, but really in a state of anxiety, because it looked like we were not going to make it. But I want to thank you all because we reached it.
Thank you, Norma. Janet?
Right. Hello, everyone. And I would just like to start by acknowledging the people who've organized this great party, and Alexandra for your excellent comparing and dancing skills. I'd also like to, I actually came to the ABS negotiations relatively late, and I had not expected to ever be in the position of co-chairing anything if I could possibly help it, because it was always seemed so complicated and complex. And I remember several rounds of working group meetings. I think I started at ABS 7, so I really am a latecomer to this process, and feeling after even 2 or 3 meetings, I do not know what they're talking about. And I do also remember when we then got into smaller group negotiations, as you inevitably do, and you weren't even allowed to bring anyone in with you into those negotiations, how terrified I was. But I think I'd also like to acknowledge the excellent work that Tim and Fernando did, and a shout out to Fernando because he was my co-chair in the Intergovernmental Committee that followed after the adoption, and his wise counsel, his patience, his knowledge, his incredible knowledge, and really, really helped steady me, but also he was just an excellent colleague and friend. So I do, when you speak to him next to him, but I'm going to reach out to him as well, please pass him my warmest regards. In terms of the highs and lows, like Norma, I think the high must be when it was adopted, when the protocol was adopted, and it was such an intense meeting. I think it was supposed to end at midnight, and somehow clocks can be changed in Japan so that we were still negotiating, and it was still going to be adopted on the 30th, as I recall, but it was still your birthday, Hugo, the way that they managed that. But I think that the Japanese government too certainly facilitated to enable us to reach that wonderful sort of adoption and to finish the negotiations. In terms of the lows, I mean, as I was reflecting on the experience and looking at those photos, thank you for that photo montage, I was really struck, and I'd forgotten just how big the negotiations were, how many people were in the rooms, how big the delegations were. I was, just thinking, goodness me, that you could bring all those people together from different regions. I think maybe Tim, at the beginning in your introduction on the history, you talked about the distrust. I think certainly coming in when I did, I just felt that for the longest time, we were talking past each other. And that sense of, as Hugo said, the access and utilization on one hand, without which there would be no benefits. We did lots of toing and froing around that kind of paradigm, if you like. And who can forget the long nights that we spent talking about, can you remember derivatives, pathogens, then being told constantly, remember that it should be a song about it. Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. So looking too at the way in which the EU negotiates, I kind of think, well, actually, perhaps I wasn't as pessimistic as some people about us reaching agreement, because nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. And as long as there's time on the clock, we can reach agreement. But I think it required sort of respect for each other, if not entirely trust in each other, that we were respectful, that we learned to listen and develop good listening skills, and kind of kept our minds open, and we had to be patient and flexible. And I also think that what was really important, I don't know if people can remember, there was a moment when I think most of us were here on the panel, were in the room, when Tim and Fernando were chairing a meeting, and you were giving fortune cookies to people who kind of contributed by being flexible and helping move the negotiations along. And I did manage to score one fortune cookie in that evening. But I also remember a particularly tense moment, which kind of encapsulated the kind of dynamic that was in the meeting, where one particular delegate kind of became, maybe, we all get frazzled and became a little bit personal in the comments that were being made, from one side to another. And Fernando came in extremely strongly. He kind of like hit the gavel and reminded us that we should, as I remember it, and it was really indelibly ingrained in my memory, and something that I pass on to people when I'm sort of training people in negotiation. And I think Fernando's words were, you can be tough on the issues, but not on the person. And one of the things that I thought was wonderful about the negotiation, even in the darkest times, and even at times when there did seem to be a lot of mistrust or distrust in the room, after each negotiation, we all went out and had a drink. We all partied and we danced and, shook hands, gave each other a hug. And I thought that was really important, that we remembered not to take things personally or to personalize things, that we should remain sort of open-minded and be able to, not take things personally or to personalize things, so that we could see the opportunities, that we could remain objective, notwithstanding that we had to do our business, we had to deliver for our governments, for our organizations, for our region, but that it wasn't personal. And I think that was really important. And one final thing that I thought was a particular high, which I and the other women were involved in. You'll remember at ABS 8, I think, in Montreal, when we formed the Like-Minded in Spirit group of women. And that was a real highlight for me. And I think just to be part of that fantastic group of women from all across the regions. Many of them we hadn't heard speak, but were leading delegations. And I think it was really important, as is reflected in the protocol itself, to recognize, as the protocol says, the vital role of women in access and benefit sharing, and at decision-making in all levels, but also, I would say, including in the negotiations themselves. So ensuring that their voices were heard and that their contribution was reflected. And you will see that reflected in not just in the preamble to the protocol, but in the actual articles as well, such as Article 12. So that is something that I feel very honored and proud to have been part of.
Thank you, Janet. Tim, can't be a better person on this panel to also give your reflection.
Thank you, Paula. As the longer this goes on, the more nostalgic I get, and the more time I'll take. But I will try actually and be brief. I was able to reflect on it before before the panel discussion, so I can be a little bit more focused than I often am when I wax poetic about my years, the last years of ABS negotiations. I don't know if we can put up the slide of Fernando and I on a rooftop in Lima, Peru, back in about 2007. If we can't, that's fine. You've seen us both before. There we are. So this was taken at an expert group meeting in Peru early in our tenure after becoming co-chairs. And as you know, both Fernando and I were negotiators for many years previously. But I have to tell you, we're smiling, we're looking obviously much younger, and we're pretty buoyed in a very buoyed moment in our transition to co-chairs. And we had no idea what was in front of us, and that the highs and the lows over the course of the negotiations, we all experienced them. Everyone did, of course, who were in the rooms late night and early morning, but we had absolutely no idea just how difficult it was going to be. But enough about difficulties. You know, in terms of a sustained high, I think one method of getting through for us, and I think for all of you as well, was, and I think Jenny, you've mentioned it, was humor and a little bit of laughter. And in our dealings with one another, Fernando and I, we had fortunately a similar sense of humor, and we tried to project that into the room, not always successfully. And in fact, one lesson in particular that I learned fairly early on was that humor isn't, it's very difficult to apply universal humor. You know, there are cultural differences, obviously through interpretation. There are, you know, communication differences, and there's just different senses of humor. And what we discovered actually worked, and it was usually at our own expense, was more slapstick humor, physical humor that everyone seemed to get in the room. So it was very difficult for us. You know, we casted ourselves as seasoned negotiators and leaders and very complex and sophisticated individuals, but we actually had to use slapstick comic approaches to get everyone laughing. And after a while, it certainly got easier and easier to do just that. So that was a lot of fun, and people joined in. And despite the very serious negotiations that was taking place, and I do recall, and there's a picture of two indigenous IFB representatives in the montage, Alejandro, that you broadcast, and with some T-shirts on. And I don't know if we can go to the camera here just a moment. Bear with me for a moment. Can we go back to me? Oh, yes, good. So I was given, and this was with Fernando, a T-shirt during a very critical meeting. They were all critical, of course, but not always conclusive, that's for sure. But I was given a T-shirt. I've got it on today. I don't know if you can see it, but it says ABS, and the S, of course, is in square brackets because nothing's ever agreed, really. And it says the Deja Vu Tour, and it says goodwill, good faith, good times. And on the back, of course, and there were only two, this is a collector's item, believe me, there are only two shirts of this kind in the world. And on the back of it, it says, co-chair. So even in the thickest and darkest set of negotiations in Montreal in July of 2010, when we still haven't, believe it or not, we had not agreed in the entire room to, one, what was the objective of the emerging instrument? And I have these in my notes. What were we negotiating? Incredibly so, with only a few months left to go, we had parties in the room who would not agree that this was merely a protocol, was a legally binding instrument. Can you imagine? With only months to go, less than 3 months to go. Incredible moment and an incredible low for me personally. I should likely stop here, but let me just share with one more memory. If we could show the slide of the COP9, COP10 schematic. And some people think that we're very lucky, and we were in fact very lucky. The reason we have the protocol, however, wasn't merely because we were lucky or because of the courage of the German presidency, of the Japanese presidency, and everyone in the room. That's not entirely why we have the protocol. One key high for me and Fernando was the acceptance at COP9, so 2008 in Bonn, of the plan, the ABS plan. This was exceedingly important, not just for us personally as co-chairs, but for the entire process. Finally, we actually embedded, and it was reflected in the plan, we finally had a deadline. And that deadline was reflected in the 6-month rule for, of course, for adoption. This was a crucial plan because we had the resources behind it, because the parties agreed to it, because we had enough inputs from stakeholders, from indigenous peoples, from experts, and from the parties themselves. We actually finally had the means and the strategy and the opportunity to finish. So for me, that was the absolute highlight, with the exception, of course, like others, of those final moments in Nagoya. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I know I just saw in the chat box all of the panelists getting an invitation for lunch for the hard work that the panel has done. So certainly thank you for the invitation. But of course, we have reflected on how the negotiations went and what we did. But certainly 10 years is also a reasonable amount of time to reflect on the implementation. And through the question and answer box and the chat box, I was also able to collect a few questions, which I'd like to ask the next panelist, Lucy Mulanke, to also reflect, is the implementation experiences. And the reason why I'm bringing Lucy here is because of the very important role the indigenous people and local communities are playing in this entire process. And Lucy, a couple of points that I picked up from the chat box on the question and answer, the questions are that in spite of the protocol asking for monetary and non-monetary benefits from an ABS perspective, we still are not seeing much of information or experience in dealing with the non-monetary benefits. At the same time, inventorizing the local resources and ensuring the local people and the communities get direct benefits from access and benefit sharing framework implementation at the national level is something where we are still looking for more experiences and more access. And from your perspective, what is that you can share with us in terms of ensuring an effective implementation of the protocol, not only now, but also into the future? Lucy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bala, and thank you everyone. And it's really great. And at the beginning, when we started, I was saying, well, I don't think there's any point of us panelists speaking because the party was getting greater and greater. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. And indeed, implementation is one of the areas where indigenous peoples, we are looking at it very keenly. And unfortunately, as we all know, in terms of implementation, the work is just beginning. There's still a lot to be done. And for us, indigenous peoples and local communities, we have known a struggle where we keep on, working harder to ensure that our rights are really recognized, and then our indigenous peoples, and especially the communities at the ground level, are also recognized. Their rights are recognized, which is still a big challenge. And unfortunately, we are also seeing that many governments are really still not putting a lot of emphasis in terms of discussing areas of traditional knowledge, as we have always expected that when we talk about traditional knowledge and what the Nagoya Protocol has put there, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And even though we know that Nagoya Protocol is really very positive for indigenous peoples, because it has provided us a tool, some tools for respect and recognition of IPLC's contribution to the convention and also to the genetic resources and so on. And we have seen like these tools are some of them, like for example, the being able to prepare and consolidate and be able to produce their own community, biocultural community protocols. Some of those tools are really very important because they have helped the indigenous people to put back their customary laws together, being able to work with the governments. And not all governments actually are really very active in terms of supporting indigenous people to do that, which is also a problem in terms of looking at some of them that they have not done a lot in terms of the domesticating the Nagoya Protocol at the national level and involving those and really making sure that there is full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. So that's where we are finding quite a lot of gaps in terms of the implementation process. But we hope that when governments put in a lot of effort and also funding to make sure that they really come up to kind of a more active implementation of the Nagoya Protocol, then it will be good. And we also know that some of the governments at the same time have not even prepared any laws on traditional knowledge. There are just a few governments that have done that. And I think we need to have key players to continue really supporting the governments to do that. We know that there is a lot that is going on in terms of discussion of traditional knowledge in other forums like the WIPO and other discussions, and also at the CBD level. But indigenous people, we are resilient people, and we will continue discussing that and making sure that our resources, our genetic resources, as they are discussed, we are also fully involved. So Bala, there is a lot that needs to be really taken a bit more serious in terms of, I'm not saying that the work is not serious, it's very serious, but I think there's also need to make sure that it's collective and it's also the inclusion. And as I always say, that the human rights perspective is very important to ensure that the governments really involve indigenous peoples. As the discussion was going on, I was remembering and saying that, of course, for us also, we had our highs and lows in terms of the negotiations, but the highs and lows are still there for us as indigenous people. But the implementation process can really be able to move more faster if we all work together and be able to have different key players contributing in terms of involving indigenous peoples and supporting them in the work that they are doing already in the community, biocultural community protocols, and also other laws that have already been put in place to make sure there is enough awareness and capacity building for indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Very, very, again, very focused intervention and very pertinent points. Of course, for those of us who are involved in the implementation at national and local levels, we on a regular basis, on a daily basis, face some of these challenges in terms of how do we ensure that the benefits reach towards conservation, because the entire purpose of having an access and benefit sharing framework is to look at benefits that accrue for conservation, that accrue for local communities to actually recognize their efforts contributing to conservation. I've actually looked at the chat box and also several questions that actually have been asked by the participants, but I'd like to consolidate some of them because of lack of time. It's difficult to answer each and every one of those questions individually. But one common element that is emerging is the current and the future implementation elements of it is that how do we balance using an access and benefit sharing between the economics of biodiversity and genetic resources, the development aspects, the sustainable development goals, achievement of the goals, as well as ensuring that it contributes to empowering the local communities to continue their conservation efforts. I'd like to actually pose this question to Norma and to David to get their perspectives.
Well, I think it was a real challenge, and it still be a challenge to combine the access to genetic resources and to make sure about the distribution of real benefits to the communities. And also, I would like to put forward the importance of this protocol in regards to other multilateral international agreements that there are in place now, and also obligations of countries in in the corpus juris of intellectual property and trade agreements. And it's certainly, the Nagoya Protocol is very important, and it puts forward the interest and the wishes of the local communities and indigenous communities, and of course countries themselves. But as it was mentioned before in the conference, if there's no access and if there's no utilization of resources, there's no benefits. So I think that's the most challenging part that we've been facing. And of course, once benefits come in, how we are going to distribute them. That's mainly, to us, one of the largest and most important challenges.
Thank you, Norma. David?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bara. Indeed, that's a very important and yet very challenging question. And very important in that this benefit sharing indeed has ramifications into conservation and sustainable use, in that conservation has an opportunity cost. And therefore, indeed, indigenous and local communities, traditional knowledge holders and the like need to benefit if they are to be convinced that biodiversity should be conserved and used sustainably. Challenging in that, again, in especially in developing country settings where we have lots of indigenous and local communities, sometimes the benefits may not be sufficient for all of them. We have experience in my country where revenues from entry into protected areas are shared with the neighboring communities, but again, still there are challenges as to how far do you go from the source or the location of these genetic resources. In that, where there are benefits, everybody would want to have a share. And if you want to consider everybody for sharing of benefits, then the benefits, the shares got by each of them will be so small that they will make no impact and they will be meaningless. So sometimes you have to engage the local communities and their leadership to make sure that you come to some agreement. Either you put the resources into investments that would be of benefit to the entire community, and they have to participate in selecting which areas you are going to invest these resources in. In our case here, when it comes to revenue sharing, this is from protected areas. I imagine the same could be borrowed when it comes to resources arising from the utilization of genetic resources. The areas that people have often zeroed on within communities would be like probably improving on health centers, improving on community schools, maybe constructing or repairing a bridge if it is a major problem within an area and things like that. But it's always a challenge because even when you choose the smallest administrative unit neighboring the source of the genetic resources, those who are immediately neighboring also feel they have been segregated against, and they are often disgruntled and not happy. Then, of course, the other challenge is that if you are going to share benefits with the traditional knowledge holders, some of this knowledge tends to go beyond different communities, even different ethnic groups. You find the knowledge is shared. Then again, it becomes another challenge on which one should benefit and which one should not. Because again, you cannot share the benefits, which are often limited in magnitude. You can't share with everybody who is interested. But then countries need to strike a balance with the beneficiary communities, and of course, to also involve them in the discussion in a transparent manner. Because sometimes they think you have got a lot of money from the resources, when in actual sense, is not. So if you involve them right from the beginning and they already know how much you are getting out of it, then it becomes easier to explain to them how it is being appropriated and to who. So the key point here is to involvement and openness and transparency when we are dealing with local communities as government agencies or private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Very, very sort of pertinent points you raised. And of course, we have a very interesting question from one of our participants. And this I'd like to pass on to Hugo and to Lucy. And the question is that if we were to negotiate the protocol in 2020, what is that we would have done differently? I know it's a little challenging question, but it's a very interesting question. I thought you can reflect on that for a minute each.
Thank you for this easy question. I think that probably what would be necessary to be done is to make sure that all stakeholder communities are truly at the table. Because when I look back to the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol, I think that there were some constituencies that did not engage in time or not at all, which means that there are elements in the Nagoya Protocol that are somehow not in tune with developments in other constituencies. And here I talk about the research constituency, the health constituency, and I think that that is something that probably, not because of the fault of the negotiating community there, but I think that the engagement wasn't there. So I think that that is a key thing that I think we would do differently. And secondly, I think that at the time of the negotiation of the protocol, we became for better or for worse, we became a very tight-knit family. And the family fights with each other. But in the end, we are all in it together. But what really I wouldn't want to see anymore is the isolation of the Nagoya Protocol negotiations from the mainstream CBD negotiations. And remember Nagoya, I think it was so indicative. All our colleagues, when they entered the conference center, went on to the big conference rooms in the back, and we had to climb up 2 flights of stairs or escalators, and then we were in 2 rooms at the back of a corridor. And I think that that really meant we were cut off from the mainstream of the discussions somehow. And I think that this was not to the benefit of the integration of the third objective in the overall discussions under the CBD. So those are 2 things that I think I would do differently if I had to advise Tim, who would still be our co-chair, on how to do it differently this time and how to bring sort of certain things about in a different way. Thank you.
So, for
Thank you,
me,
Hugo. Lucy?
I think for me, I would also do it, add a few points on that. And one of the other key stakeholders, apart from what Hugo has just mentioned about research, there is that aspect of the private sector, the business people. To me, I feel like we did not work a lot with them. And for indigenous people, we needed all to be able to work with all the stakeholders so that they can be able to understand who we are and how and what we are really demanding or what we really want to understand. And they can also understand us, because I think that the research and the private sector were really missing. And the other thing is that I could have done differently. I would have really, with our indigenous peoples and local communities, I think we would have really managed clearly to be able to add the FPIC, the free prior informed consent than just have the PIC, which is the prior informed consent, because those were our low moments when we were trying to have the FPIC included, considering the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. And the other, I think, the other important thing is that I think it would have been really good, like now, if to discuss Nagoya Protocol, when we are really looking at the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we would discuss together collectively with other aspects and other areas of development. And I think that would have really been a good direction in terms of moving on. And I think even at the moment with the post-2020, we are still discussing it, but I would have tried to make sure that it's more enhanced than it is right now. So those are some of the areas which I would have done differently. And I hope that these are the things the others also would have thought about. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. We continue to receive some very interesting questions from the participants. Thank you very much for sharing. But as I mentioned, because of lack of time, we'll not be able to individually answer all of them. I am trying to actually include as many questions as possible in my triggers to the panelists for seeking their responses. But in that point, I think we'll be wrapping up in next few minutes. And I'd like to start from where Lucy left in terms of the current discussions that are happening to have the post-2020 global biodiversity framework negotiated and adopted at the forthcoming COP15 of the convention. This question is to all the panelists, and I'd like to invite all of you to respond to that in not more than 1 minute each. In terms of not just looking at the future of the Nagoya Protocol, but in terms of looking at the future of the implementation of the convention as a whole and the contribution the Nagoya Protocol can make. Because if you look at some of the decisions that parties have taken in the recent past, is to look at how the protocols of the convention and the convention will work together to ensure that we collectively realize all the three objectives of the convention, not just one of them, even though the protocols we recognize address some of the specifics that are in the convention. So what would be your takeaway to those who currently are sitting, drafting, negotiating, and coming to grips with having a final framework for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework? I'll start with you, Tim. Quick reflections in 1 minute, please.
Very good. Thank you, Bala. Just building on a number of comments, responses from the other panelists. I mean, I agree, Ugo, that that the risk of siloing, functionally siloing, process siloing ABS from the mainstream, the remainder of the convention's business at Nagoya and previously at other COPs, does lead to the opposite of integration and works against integrating the three mutually supportive objectives of the convention. So it's quite ironic. On the other hand, by ghettoizing, by putting in a different room, floors and miles away, a specific negotiation, like a functioning treaty-built policy, you did not detrain the rest of the work of the convention and the COPs. So the advantage of putting it somewhere else was that the regular business of the convention could proceed. So in the context of post-2020, we have a similar situation. Well, first of all, the post-2020 discussions are not a discussion of something that's legally binding, which is a good thing at this juncture, I believe, for the co-chairs and for the process. If I were the co-chairs, and if I were approached by the co-chairs of the post-2020 discussions, I would suggest that they look at my co-chairs and my strategy that was employed for Nagoya. And it's completely relevant today for any process as it was back then. And because it also includes the idea of a holistic approach and integrating, and also built on Lucy's point, it's meant to engage the people that will actually implement it. And generally that's not really governments, not on the ground. It's indigenous peoples, it's industry, it's academia. Those are the people who actually often have solutions to policy problems. So what did we do during the negotiations? We spent a lot of time talking to stakeholders. getting around governments in some cases, because we knew that the keys to unlock the problems often lay with the stakeholders, with the indigenous peoples, with the research community. So we had our own bilateral discussions in cross regions in order to understand their problems and what the solutions might be.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Very, very sort of interesting points you have raised for our colleagues who are looking at the global framework post-2020. Janet?
You're muted, Janet. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that I haven't been working directly on CBD or ABS issues for the last few years, but just I think the same principles that we applied in the negotiations, I think, are still valid today. But times have changed and we've moved on, and we've also touched on some issues where we realized looking back that we didn't, as both Tim and Hugo have said, maybe have all the right stakeholders at the table. So I do think that in the same frame that we need to be maybe communicating better, doing a lot more by way of capacity building and providing technical assistance, but also informing ourselves as negotiators better back home and making sure that when we come away from negotiation, that when we come back home, part of the implementation is around domestic implementation. And I think that we need to just be more of a bridge and not so siloed, so that you go to negotiations, you come back, but you have to then kind of socialize other government departments who are relevant, who might not understand their relevance. And then beyond that, to talk to, as we've mentioned, the research community, the health community, our indigenous and local communities. And also, I mentioned before, women, you know, we have to apply the same principles that are enshrined in the CBD, I mean, in the convention, in the protocol, to our domestic outreach and implementation.
Thank you, Janet. We have Norma, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bala. I think after this COVID period of time, we understand and we see that the conservation of biodiversity is very important. And all that together with other environmental agreements. So for the post-2020, it's very important to continue on this conservation path, but to make sure also to bring together all the different interested parties. As Tim mentioned, there's not only governments, but also the academia and the indigenous and local communities, and also the private sector. So I think that will be the most challenging area, or the most challenging way of doing it, but only by having a transparent and collaborative process, we will be able to bring out some an important post-2020 goals for the multilateral arena.
Thank you. Hugo?
It's a bit of a tricky thing for me to comment on that one, because I think I'm among those who is newly involved in the ABS process. So for me, this is a very real challenge. I think that I will repeat what I said before. If I get to talk to the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, I would very much ask them to de-silo the process, because I still see that in the CBD, in the current CBD ABS discussions, there are too many experts around and not enough of the generalists. And that way we lose the link to resource mobilization. We lose the link to technology transfer. We lose the link to how the sort of, if benefits are, how they actually can be shared. And we also lose the link to this general CBD provisions on research and so on. So I think it's really the same as before, but I think really applied to the current negotiation process. And it will be important to listen to the experts, and will be important to listen to the actual communities that are involved in the access and in the utilization. And I'm not sure that that is currently the case, because the world has moved on so much since Nagoya that we need to bring in the experience of the world into the negotiations. That cannot be done by focalizing on the experts that may be involved in the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol at the national level. And I'm really worried if we don't succeed in doing that, we're going towards a very difficult decision.
Thank you, Hugo. David? David,
you're
are you
muted,
there?
David.
Can you hear
Yes,
me?
David, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues. And I think this is a very important, but again, tricky question. Indeed, the need to involve all the key stakeholders in the negotiations is very critical, and it makes a lot of sense. But then there are issues on how do we disentangle the private sector, research community, and IRCs from the decision-making processes, and at the same time still fit within the rules of procedure of the CBD. Because if we are to engage them, yes, we need the information, we need their input in the negotiations, and maybe we may have to devise ways of bringing them in at strategic points within either the working group or contact groups to provide information, and also make interventions as and when issues of concern to them are on the floor, mentioned, then leave the parties to make the decisions. But at the same time, parties can also include such experts or stakeholders as part of the national official delegation, so that they can bring in their expertise at the right and appropriate time. Now, the issue of multitasking and the need to keep the convention and its protocols together is also something I think is very important indeed, to make sure that the convention and its protocols develop in harmony. But it's often a challenge, especially for small delegations, when you find you are having to deal with so many important things and important stakeholders almost at the same time, juggling from room to room. Hugo mentioned the issue of having to move several stairs or several floors to get to another room. Maybe that would be thrown to the parties that intend to host, to make sure that they devise means. I remember in Nagoya, much as the challenge was there was a big tent in which one of the working groups was sitting, such that if the facilities are already not designed in such a way, then they could improvise temporary facilities like tents, so that the working group rooms and contact group rooms are not very far from each other, if one has to shut off from one room to another. Otherwise, I think we need to bring on board innovative ways of getting the information we need from these other important stakeholders without violating the rules of procedure, and also without making it very difficult for the negotiators, especially those who are small, who have small delegations. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Lucy, you did mention about this. That was a trigger for this particular
question that I asked the panelists. Do you have anything more to add, Lucy, at this point?
Yeah, I think I want to also say that the negotiations at the Global Biodiversity Framework 2020 are really very critical, and they are going on, and it's been a lot of discussion going on. And it's important that our rights as indigenous peoples in the Nagoya Protocol are as a minimum standard. And as many have said, our collective actions for indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, must be really strongly be reflected. There are quite a number of recommendations that have been given in there, and I think we really need to make sure that those are also reflected, and that the key stakeholders, as we've mentioned, issues are really on board for the global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I think more or less it's time for us to wrap up, because our celebrations are on almost for the last 3 hours. So I'd like to wrap up at this particular point of time. And I'd like to mention at this point that in addition to the webinars that Alejandro mentioned, we're also organizing 2 webinars tomorrow, which will focus on the implementation experiences, Nagoya Protocol, where we'll hear from industry experts, from indigenous local community representatives, and also from governments on what has been the implementation experience. And we'll have a follow-up webinar on the 31st that will look into the future of the protocol, where we'll have presentations on the ongoing discussions on issues like digital sequence information, synthetic biology, and how they potentially could influence the future of the Nagoya Protocol implementation, as well as discussions that are shaping up the final way in which we are going to look at the global biodiversity framework. So please do join us. The information and the links are available on the ABS UNDP global website. And with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their very insightful comments, and all the participants for their very active engagement and active participation. As I mentioned, that unfortunately we're not able to answer every single question that was posted, but we'll attempt to answer to your questions. And if you have any further comments or inputs you would like to provide, I'm sure colleagues at the UNDP-ABS Global Project team would be more than happy to receive your questions and receive your inputs. And once again, thank you very much. And I'd like to once again thank the CVD Secretariat and the UNDP-ABS Global Project for giving me this opportunity to relive, to reconnect with a lot of old memories, colleagues, friends, but also be a part of this discussion as we are celebrating this particular 10th anniversary and looking forward to the 20th anniversary in the next 10 years' time. Over to you, Alejandro. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bala. A big applause to you and to all our panelists. Our gratitude to all of you for the work that you have done and the role that you have played to make it happen. Excellent reflections to start this Global ABS conference. Before concluding, as we are expressing gratitude to everyone who has been pushing the realization of the benefit sharing principle in the last years, it could not be fair to conclude without paying tribute to those colleagues that were with us in our way and are gone. I'm not trying to bring here a complete list of those colleagues, which would be very difficult, but just to bring some personal examples that could make you think about those of your colleagues that made a difference and now are gone. I would like to mention Johan Bodegaard from Sweden. In meetings, Johan was extremely serious in his corporal and face expression. Indeed, we used to call him Iceman, as he was from the Scandinavian countries. I remember that during one of the regular EU coordinations in ABS 8 in Montreal in 2009, Sweden was the presidency, and I, as part of the Spanish delegation, requested the floor. And he said, "Mexico, you have the floor," which was quite hilarious at that time in the room. But he was right, that we were very connected with Mexico at the time. That links with another colleague from Mexico, Ambassador Damaso Luna. Many good stories and anecdotes with Damaso. He had the gift of talking about serious things always in a very funny way, without losing his seriousness, which is, as previously expressed by Tim, a very difficult art. I would like also to mention our dear national focal point from Mexico, Alejandra Barrios, who passed away last year. And I would like also to remember all the colleagues that have passed away with the COVID, with all the incredible personal losses that we are all suffering. In the context of the Global ABS project, we lost our national coordinator at our UNDP office in Sudan, Ms. Shama Meki. Finally, it is important to remember the indigenous peoples that have lost their lives during the last years in the first line of defense of our biodiversity. We know that the pressure of resources have increased in these 10 years, and it will continue to increase in the coming years. And therefore, it is important that we not only pay tribute to them, but we acknowledge them whenever we request more efforts on biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing as a key element to integrate there. No? Our gratitude to all of them and to all of us. We know we are just at the beginning of ABS as an international process, but also in this conference. So before closing, let me briefly introduce you the incoming sessions of this Global ABS conference. Following sessions will be on Wednesdays. Next Wednesday, November 4th, we will have a dialogue between governments and researchers, where researchers will have the chance to learn more about ABS and how it is being applied around the world. And governments and policymakers will be able also to listen the key challenges that researchers are facing when they apply ABS. Next, we will have a round on the third session, another dialogue between governments and private sector. In this case, we will try to get the feedback of the private sector, biotech sector, on the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and the challenges also that they are facing with the same spirit, that governments have to be exposed to private sector and private sector to governments. The fourth day would be on Wednesday, November 18th, and this will be a dialogue between governments and indigenous peoples and local communities. Again, with the same idea, trying to take a stock of the progress made during the last years in the implementation of indigenous rights related to biodiversity and to access and benefit sharing, and what is needed in the coming years. And the final session would be on November 25th. And as it was already mentioned, we will focus on building the ABS we'll need for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. I think the key has been mentioned is to have a round of dialogues. I'm sure we will not be able to solve all the ABS problems during this ABS conference, but the important thing is that we mobilize all the stakeholders and we are able to replicate and to continue those dialogues at the different levels, national level, regional levels, and of course, in the negotiations of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. My heartfelt thanks to the interpreters and the colleagues of the Secretariat and the Global ABS project that are working as one to make possible this conference. And that's all from our side. I hope you have enjoyed the party and see you all next Wednesday. Apologies. Thank you. Bye-bye.